The morning my phone lit up with 93 missed calls from my mom and dad, I stared at the screen without feeling the panic they expected. 10 years earlier, my father had left me, alone at a crowded train station as a joke. My parents laughed, along with my uncles and cousins, betting whether I could find my way home before dark. I was only 10 years old. I still remember the echo of the departing train, the smell of diesel, and the cold metal bench where I waited, convinced they would return in a few minutes. Instead, I watched strangers reunite with their families while the station slowly emptied. Every passing hour made their laughter feel louder inside my head. When night fell, I finally understood the truth. I wasn't forgotten. I had been humiliated for someone's entertainment. That single moment quietly erased the family I thought I had. I didn't cry when I walked out of the station. I didn't scream or beg anyone to help me find them. I simply kept walking, carrying nothing except a small backpack and the painful realization that home was no longer a place waiting for me. Now, 10 years later, the people who had once laughed while abandoning me suddenly couldn't stop calling. They believed they were searching for the child they had left behind. They had no idea that child had disappeared the moment their train pulled away. People often assume that one cruel decision destroys a family. In my case, it only exposed what had been true all along. Even before the train station, I was the child everyone found easy to laugh at. I was quiet, careful, and eager to please. While my cousins were praised for being bold, I was the one handed everyone's bags, told to stay out of the way, and blamed whenever something went wrong. If a glass broke, someone joked that I had probably touched it. If a family game needed a loser, they looked at me before the rules were even explained. My father called it building character. My mother never started the jokes, but she almost never stopped them either. She would lower her eyes, smile awkwardly, and tell me not to be so sensitive. That hurt more than the teasing itself. Silence from someone who should protect you can feel louder than insults. Over the years, I convinced myself that if I worked harder, behaved better, or stayed quieter, they would finally see me as someone worth respecting. I chased approval that was always just out of reach. Every birthday, every family gathering, and every holiday became another chance to earn love that was never freely given. The train station wasn't an isolated prank. It was simply the first time their cruelty became impossible to excuse. After that day, I stopped expecting rescue. A retired railway employee noticed I had been sitting alone for hours and contacted the local authorities. Instead of searching for my parents, I answered every question calmly. Deep inside, I had already accepted that anyone willing to leave a frightened child behind for a laugh wasn't coming back because they cared. That night, I made a promise to myself that shaped every decision afterward. If the people who underestimated me had written my future in their minds, I would spend the rest of my life proving that they had completely misunderstood the person they abandoned. They thought they had stranded a helpless child. What they had really done was set free someone who would never again depend on their approval. The years that followed taught me something I hadn't understood as a child. Some people don't betray you once, they simply keep finding quieter ways to remind you that, in their eyes, you never mattered. After the authorities contacted my parents, they never rushed to bring me home. Days passed before they finally appeared. My father smiled as if nothing serious had happened, telling everyone it had been a harmless lesson in independence. He even laughed while repeating the story to relatives, carefully leaving out the part where I had spent an entire night terrified and alone. The room always filled with polite laughter. No one asked how frightened I had been. No one asked whether I had eaten. Whenever I tried to explain what I remembered, my father would interrupt with a patient smile and say, "You're exaggerating. You were never really in danger." My mother would quietly nod beside him, avoiding my eyes. That silent agreement hurt more than his words ever could. Family gatherings became performances, where I was expected to smile while everyone retold the station story as if it were their favorite joke. My cousins copied my father's tone, asking whether I still needed directions to find my way home. The adults chuckled. Someone would pat my shoulder and tell me to learn to take a joke. So I stopped defending myself. I answered with short sentences, kept my emotions hidden, and watched people reveal exactly who they were whenever they believed. I would never answer back. Years later, when I finally left, no one tried very hard to stop me. They assumed I would return after life became difficult. According to them, I was too quiet, too soft. and too dependent to survive on my own. That assumption became the greatest gift they ever gave me. While they continued believing I would eventually come back asking for help, I quietly built a life where I no longer needed anything they could offer. By the time they realized I was gone for good, the distance between us could no longer be measured in miles. It was measured in the respect they had spent a lifetime refusing to give. The turning point didn't arrive with an argument or a dramatic goodbye. It came on an ordinary afternoon, disguised as another family gathering. I had returned only because my mother insisted it would be different this time. She promised everyone had matured, that old mistakes had been left in the past. For a brief moment, I wanted to believe her. Dinner started peacefully enough. Plates were passed around. Conversations drifted from work to holidays. And for the first time in years, I almost relaxed. Then my father stood up with a smile. He tapped his glass with a spoon and announced, "Let's tell the story that made him famous." The room erupted in knowing laughter before he had even spoken another word. He described the train station as if it were the funniest memory of his life. Every pause was followed by another round of chuckles. My cousins repeated the punchlines before he could finish them. Even relatives who hadn't been there laughed because everyone else was laughing. Then he looked directly at me. "At least it made you stronger," he said. "You should be thanking me." For a few seconds, the room became strangely quiet. Not because they felt guilty, because they were waiting to see if I would react the way I always had. That was the moment I realized they didn't regret what they had done. They regretted only that the joke had stopped entertaining them. I looked around the table and understood something that finally set me free. An apology cannot exist where people still believe they were right. I smiled politely, finished my meal, thanked my mother for the invitation, and walked out without raising my voice. No dramatic speech, no slammed doors, no final argument. That night, I changed my phone number, accepted a job offer in another city, and left before sunrise. I wasn't running away from them. I was walking toward a life where their opinions no longer had the power to define me. The child who had once waited on a station, bench for his family to return, had finally stopped waiting. Leaving was only the beginning. Freedom meant very little if I spent the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for my family to pull me back into the same cycle. I decided that the greatest answer to years of humiliation would not be anger, it would be preparation. I threw myself into work with the same determination I had once wasted trying to earn my father's approval. I studied at night, completed professional certifications, and accepted every difficult assignment that helped me grow. Within a few years, I had built a career in corporate risk management, where every decision depended on patience, documentation, and careful planning instead of emotion. That profession quietly changed the way I viewed people. I learned that every promise should be written down, every agreement carefully reviewed, and every important decision made without rushing. Emotions faded. Records remained. I carried that mindset into my personal life. I bought a modest home under my own name, built my savings, and worked with a financial advisor and an attorney to organize every contract, investment, and legal document. My contact information stayed private. My social media remained almost empty, and only a handful of trusted friends knew where I lived. I wasn't hiding. I was protecting the peace I had worked so hard to build. Occasionally, mutual relatives would send messages saying my parents wanted to reconnect. I never argued or defended my decision. I simply wished everyone well and declined. Silence proved far more effective than explanations because silence gave them nothing to twist into. Another family story. Years passed without a single direct conversation. Then, one morning, my phone, connected only to an old emergency number I had never bothered to cancel, began vibrating nonstop. 93 missed calls. Voicemails. Messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. For the first time in a decade, they weren't laughing. They were desperately trying to find the person they had once believed would always come back on his own. I looked at the screen for a long moment, placed the phone face down on my desk, and calmly returned to the meeting I had been leading. They had spent years teaching me that actions always reveal the truth. Now it was finally their turn to learn the same lesson. I didn't return the calls that day, or the next. There was no satisfaction in making them wait. I simply refused to interrupt the life I had spent 10 years building to comfort the people who had never protected mine. 3 days later, an email arrived from a lawyer representing my parents. The message was polite, almost painfully formal. My grandfather had passed away several months earlier, and before his death, he had amended his will. He had left me a handwritten letter and a share of his estate that could only be transferred after my identity was confirmed. For the first time, everything made sense. They hadn't spent days searching because they had suddenly discovered regret. They had searched because they finally needed me. I scheduled one meeting, on my terms, in my attorney's office. When my parents walked in, they looked older than I remembered. My father avoided my eyes. My mother held a box of old photographs, as though memories could replace accountability. Neither of them received the reunion they had imagined. I greeted them politely, shook their hands the way I would greet strangers, and invited them to sit. My father began explaining how much the family had missed me. My mother quietly apologized for the mistakes of the past. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, I slid a single folder across the table. Inside was a signed document declining every cent of the inheritance. Beneath it was a short handwritten note. The child you abandoned waited for you once. The man sitting in front of you doesn't need anything you can give him. The room fell silent. No accusations. No raised voices. No revenge speech. Just the sound of a pen rolling gently across the polished table before coming to a stop. I stood, wished them good health, and walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard my mother begin to cry. My father called my name only once. I didn't turn around. 10 years earlier, they had watched a train carry them away while I stood alone on the platform. This time, I was the one walking away. And for the first time in my life, I never wondered whether they would follow. News of that meeting spread through the family faster than I expected. Within a week, relatives who had ignored me for years suddenly remembered my phone number. Some insisted I should forgive, because family is family, others quietly admitted. They had always known the train station story had gone too far, but had never spoken up. Their honesty came years too late to change anything. What surprised me wasn't their reaction. It was how little power their opinions had over me anymore. As a child, every disapproving glance had felt like proof that I wasn't enough. Now, those same people were simply individuals living with the consequences of choices they had made, or the silence they had chosen to keep. A few months later, I learned that my father had stopped telling the train station story altogether. The joke that had once made every family gathering erupt with laughter had disappeared without explanation. No one found it funny anymore because everyone finally understood what it had actually revealed. It had never been about a clever prank. It had been about the kind of person willing to humiliate a child for amusement. My mother sent one final letter. She didn't ask for money or another meeting. She simply wrote that she wished she had spoken up when it mattered most. I believe she meant every word, but some regrets arrive after the door has already closed. I didn't hate either of them. Hatred would have kept me tied to the past. Instead, I carried something much quieter: acceptance. The greatest consequence wasn't that they lost contact with me. It was that they would spend the rest of their lives knowing they had been given thousands of ordinary chances to protect their son, and they had chosen laughter instead. If there's anything worth remembering from my story, it's this. Cruelty doesn't become harmless because people call it a joke. And silence doesn't become kindness simply because it's comfortable. Sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't making people suffer. It's refusing to let the people who hurt you decide who you become. People sometimes ask whether I regret walking away. The honest answer is that I regret waiting so long to believe my own worth. For years, I thought healing meant receiving an apology. I imagined that one day my father would admit what he had done. My mother would finally defend me, and everything broken between us would somehow become whole again. Life taught me a quieter truth. Real peace doesn't begin when someone finally understands your pain. It begins when their understanding is no longer necessary. Today, my mornings are remarkably ordinary, and I've learned that's a blessing. I lead a team I trust, mentor young employees who remind me of the quiet child I used to be, and make sure no one under my responsibility is ever made to feel invisible. Every decision I make is guided by one simple question. Would this make someone feel safe? If the answer is no, I choose differently. The inheritance I refused never made me wealthy. The life I built for myself did. Not because of money, titles, or success, but because every achievement belongs to the person who earned it without depending on the approval of those who once laughed at him. I still think about that train station sometimes. Not with anger, but with compassion for the frightened 10-year-old who believed he had been left behind forever. If I could stand beside him today, I wouldn't promise that life would become easy. I'd simply tell him to keep walking, One day, the road ahead would become far more beautiful than the home behind him. As for my parents, I truly hope they find peace. Carrying regret is a punishment I wouldn't wish on anyone, but forgiveness doesn't always mean reopening a closed door. Sometimes it simply means putting down the weight and continuing your journey without looking back. That morning began with 93 missed calls. It ended with complete silence. And in that silence, I finally found what I'd been searching. For since the day a train pulled away without me, the greatest revenge was never making them lose a son, it was refusing to lose myself.